Alright, so this is Project Warlock. Project Warlock is one in a line of many FPS currently that are trying to sort of bring back the old school way of things, and I think time will tell which ones actually succeed and which ones do not, but as of right now, we see quite a few contenders for, you know, a Doom-like or a Quake-like shooter experience, something that takes us all back to like the 90s FPS. And I don't think there needs to only be one. I think that many can actually do their own thing and succeed and do it very well. But I do think that from what I've seen, there's going to be quite a bit of competition as to what doing it right actually means. And you have cases like, for instance, Dusk, a very well-known one that actually just came out like a few minutes before I started recording this, which is aiming more for the sort of Quake 1 and 2, maybe a little Unreal for good measure kind of era. Project Warlock, however, is going squarely for something more like Hexen or Blood, the really, really good games. I really love those. Those are actually some of my favorites of that particular time period. I played a lot of Hexen, and Blood is really good. Let's forget about the sequel. So, in this case, you have a sort of classic-style FPS with lots and lots of weapons, big bosses, as you can see right about now, lots of enemy variety, and even a couple of modern touches, but not too many, I think, because that's sort of what a lot of games like this are going for. I think one of the best ways to actually do this whole, it's like FPS of old but new sort of thing, is to understand what made FPS of old fun, first of all, because just making it look old isn't enough, and understanding how things like enemy and map design actually mattered in those older games, and how weapon choice, I suppose, weapon selection actually mattered as well, because it wasn't just a case of having exciting weapons, you actually needed reasons to use more than one of them. And combining that with what is potentially more like a couple of modern touches, not necessarily large selections of them, or even necessary ones, in my opinion, that can really just be something pretty old school, but I think the ones that will do the best are ones that are a bit of a hybrid between old and new school ideas, about 75% old and 25% new, if you get what I mean, where they're very much based on old mechanics, but with a few new twists. And this game is actually exactly that, pretty much. The map design is extremely reminiscent of Doom, Doom 2, Blood, and Hexen and Heretic, with lots of flat areas and lots of elevators, buttons, secrets in the walls, switches everywhere, getting keys and key cards. All that stuff is very much present here, and it actually, the developers clearly understand what made that interesting, what made it work, because they didn't seem to just put anything into this game because Doom had it, or because Hexen did it. It's more of understanding what actually made those fun to begin with, and then building from there, which is an important distinction when it comes to trying to, you know, do an older game and make it new again, rather than trying to cash in on nostalgia. The first thing to talk about probably is the weapon selection, which is pretty large in this game, larger than a lot of old school games were, but that's because of the weapon upgrade system. So we're going against the old school idea of having a very set, specific selection of weapons that all have their own reason for being there, and there isn't really a best one that always works. You have to use different ones in different situations. And combining that with the somewhat new school idea of weapon upgrades and the like, and there are in fact weapon upgrades in this, and they're very exciting weapon upgrades. They aren't just things like, you know, it does more damage or fires faster. There are they're a full-on new weapon essentially. For instance, the rocket launcher that you see right now is already pretty fun to use because it's a rocket launcher and it works very much like the sort of Quake rocket launcher did. But you can also change it into a napalm rocket launcher, which obviously fires rockets that shoot napalm everywhere, or a rapid rocket launcher that's basically like a sort of mini swarm missile launcher. Or things like this laser rifle right here that's very enjoyable to use already, but can be changed into something like a rapid fire laser rifle, very much like the plasma gun from Doom, or a railgun, a single shot weapon that can string a shot through an entire group of enemies but uses a lot of energy per shot. Every weapon has two different forms like that, which is one of the most exciting parts of the game for me, because it means a lot of experimentation. These are mutually exclusive forms, which means you have to choose one of the two, and once you choose it, that's it, you're using that. And there are these sorts of upgrade points that you can find around the levels, and that's what you actually use in order to change your weapons out. Different weapons require a different number of these points, And that's one of the best reasons to actually find secrets in the game, because the secrets contain, you know, obviously your usual stuff like health and ammo, which you may need depending on how you're doing, but also often things like experience bonuses, because there is a leveling system in the game, and these upgrade points that allow you to upgrade your weapons faster. There are also spells in the game on the right click that do various things. You're seeing a lot of one that I'm using in the background, which is a simple light spell, just lights everything up around you, which is useful obviously for exploring dark things, but I've noticed it also helps me find secrets because it tends to make the contrast in secret walls a little more visible, so it's fun to pop around various areas and see if you can find secrets with it. But there are lots more spells than that. There are, I think, about 8 of them, and one of the others that I'm using in the background is the sort of Lightning Orb spell that creates a ball of lightning where you're standing that will shock anything that comes near it. A very useful spell for dealing with those large hordes of enemies that come in various parts of the game. That was an upgrade point there. And so yeah, you have to balance your unlocking things with the idea of improving your spells and things like that. And there's, as I mentioned, also a leveling system. You get experience just from killing enemies, and of course harder enemies are worth more experience. That's that blue bar at the bottom of the screen. And you can also get treasures to find, to get more experience that way. There's a treasure that I just picked up right there, and they all have different looks to them depending on which world you're in, which I'll explain in a minute. And as you level up, you get points to put in stats. And I think the coolest thing about this isn't that, well, it's that the stats don't actually affect the gameplay too much, if that makes sense. It's not an RPG, this isn't Strife. So, you know, you don't necessarily want stats that heavily affect the gameplay in a really big way. Like, for instance, you do like no gun damage whatsoever if you don't have the right amount of a stat. None of the stats affect the damage of your guns, which in my opinion is the best way to do it in a game like this, because the weapons are supposed to be their own self-contained thing that stand on their own, and tying their damage to stats kind of ruins that, in my opinion, so they didn't do that. Instead, they do things like increase the damage with your standby melee weapons, the axe and the dagger, that you'll always have with you, and things like upping the capacity of each ammo type you can hold, upping the mana that you can hold for casting spells, and upping your health, so you can have more health, because there isn't any sort of armor in this game, like there were in a lot of classic FPS. Instead, you get more health from stats. So I think that's a much better way to do them in a game that's designed this way. I think mixing it to be like almost like Strife, but not quite, would actually kind of damage the balance of the game, so they didn't go that route, which is good. And there are lots and lots of areas to go. So I mentioned worlds. There are 5 worlds in the game that you go through, each one with a different tile set, its own different sets of enemies ascending in power as you go through the levels, its own appearances for power-ups, things like health and mana, as well as the treasures will look different depending on which world you're in, and their own boss at the end of them. And the boss fights are a lot of fun as well. You have you start in a medieval castle sort of world that is very reminiscent of something like Blood, to be honest. And you end up going through, or Strife, I suppose, you end up going through like an industrial zone, Egypt, where you can find Serious Sam's body, of course, and a couple of others ending in Hell itself, which is a little bit Doomish, as you would probably expect, and is where the difficulty definitely ramps up a bit. As far as the difficulty goes, you can actually enable a like a permadeath sort of mode. Hard mode is you have 1 life. If you die, you go back to the main menu. But there are other difficulty settings if you don't necessarily want to do that. But any death, no matter what difficulty you're on or how many lives you have left, because you can get extra lives, will set you back to the beginning of the level, Doom style. So another thing to mention, of course, is the actual level design itself, which is very, very good, and like I mentioned, extremely reminiscent of past FPS like Doom and like Hexen and Blood, and even a bit of Strife as well, because it involves very flat levels that are sort of deliberately limited to that sort of, I guess that sort of idea that everything must be on the same plane, because that's how the engine was limited back at the time. And actually taking that limitation and making the most of it, just like a map maker would at the time. And the developers have done the same here, even though they don't technically have to limit themselves to that style. They have done so in order to make it a more authentic feeling level experience, and I think they've actually done it really well. There are elevators and crazy hellish skyscrapers and stuff like that that you can ascend, so the levels aren't completely flat, but for the most part it feels like something that you could be playing through in Hexen. Man, I loved Hexen. And the enemies are also very much a big part of the experience. Just like in all those classic FPS, you have to have classic enemies that actually pose a threat and are interesting, and there are lots of different enemies for each different set of levels. And they all have their own attacks. A lot of them are, of course, based on projectiles that you can dodge if you're fast enough, which is very classic and one of the best ways to do it, in my opinion. And there are lots of melee swarming enemies as well, and depending on where you are, some of the later levels have particularly powerful and often pretty scary-looking enemies that take more specific ideas, more specific arsenals and things to actually go against effectively. You know, like giant bipedal robots that look like they belong in EDF, or these big, like, super swole Anubis dudes that can shoot like a sort of a railgun, like a lightning railgun kind of magic shot at you. Like an instant hit kind of deal that you need to be strafing before they even fire it in order to dodge it, stuff like that. And like I mentioned, the boss fights are exactly what you would expect, the sort of big, one-level, screen-wide bosses that have lots of ads and lots of different things they can throw at you, but I have to say that they are kind of the weakest part of the game, in my opinion. They're fun, but they're not particularly difficult or really all that, I suppose time-consuming isn't the way I want to say it, but they don't take a lot to learn. You can basically see what they do within the first few moments of actually facing them, and then learn how to get through it quite easily. There's no like multiple phases to most of the bosses. One of them does have multiple phases, but it doesn't really escalate that much except for just becoming faster. And I will also say that the tank boss, the boss of the second to last area, the industrial area, is kind of a real letdown because it's not difficult at all and doesn't actually do that much. Seems like it could have been a lot harder. But other than that, I think this is an absolutely fantastic game. It definitely does exactly what it sets out to do. It has a lot of content, and the weapon system is a lot of fun to mess with, and is also a reason to play through it more than once because you can, you know, select other weapons. And it even has multiplayer. The game is $12 on Steam, which is a steal in my opinion. This game is definitely a bit of a steal at $12 because there's a lot to do, and going through it will take you some time, especially if you plan on doing it in the harder difficulties. And this game definitely does a lot of the old tricks in like the Doom style, where, you know, you'll hit a switch or go to a seemingly small room to pick up a weapon, and then suddenly the walls come down and there are like 5,000 enemies behind it, and you get destroyed and have to start over. So it definitely has a lot of those old mapping tricks that make it feel very, it'll make you feel at home if you played a lot of those games when you were younger. And not only does it have those tricks, but it seems to understand how and when to use them correctly, and it pulls it off well in a way that isn't frustrating or like a look what we did there kind of moment, and is more of a genuine, like, good map-making style of doing things. I think it's a very good game, and for its price, it is absolutely well worth looking at if you have any sort of interest at all in classic FPS, because it plays like one with all the trappings, but with a couple of modern features that help it stand out, like the weapon upgrades and the spells and things like that. So that is Project Warlock, like I mentioned, available for $12 flat, which is kind of weird. Usually I see prices on Steam that are more like, you know, $11.99, but no, it's $12 exactly. And the link is in the description below this video if you want to go check it out. I have no idea if they plan on doing any sort of episode pack or expansion or DLC or anything for this game, but right now I feel that there's definitely enough to justify a purchase as it stands, because there are 5 worlds and like a dozen levels each, almost. So it's a lot of content to go through, and it's definitely a lot of fun. Thank you guys very, very much for watching. If you have any more questions about the game, or if you just want to see more, please do let me know in the comments below. And that'll be that. I'll see you guys next time.